Hello, everyone. Everyone's dancing here for another episode of On.NET Live. Welcome to 60 minutes of unscripted .NET entertainment. Our mission is to empower the .NET community to achieve more. I'm your host, Maira Wenzel, with my co-host, David Pine.
Hello.
And Cam Soper.
Howdy.
And I'd like to welcome today's guest, Shaun Walker. He's going to be talking to us about Oqtane, a CMS and application framework for Blazor and .NET MAUI. We're going to dig into that more. But first of all, Shaun, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure, I'm very excited to be here today. So I guess my claim to fame is that I was the original creator of an open source project way back like 20 years ago that was called .NET Nuke. It was later renamed to DNN, but that was my sort of first big experience with open source. We created quite a large project, created a company, raised 3 rounds of venture capital around that. It was quite a journey. I sort of parted ways with that in 2014, and I've been involved with various things in the .NET community ever since. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I think I'm in my 15th year as an MVP now. We're going to be talking about Oqtane today, which is my latest open source project. And I'm also involved with the .NET Foundation. I've actually been a volunteer with the foundation since 2014. So come on, almost a decade of participating in the .NET Foundation. A couple months ago, I decided to take a leap of faith and left my job that I had and created a couple new companies. One is a consulting company called DevEssence, which is really focused on Blazor and modern .NET development. And then the other company is Oqtane Labs, which is the steward of the Oqtane open source project that we're going to be talking about today.
Awesome. I saw Cam react when he heard about your
Yeah, so I'll just jump in here. I live in Kansas City, Missouri, and I was employed way back from like 2000 to 2007 by Commerce Bank here in Kansas City. And within our little area of the IT department, I recognized the need for a CMS. And wouldn't you know it, .NET Nuke is what came up. So I've implemented .NET Nuke. I introduced it to all my coworkers. I loved .NET Nuke. And I had no idea you were the creator of .NET Nuke. And
I didn't realize that either. I was like,
yeah.
Wait, what?
Yeah, it kind of shows your age, I would say, but no, I shouldn't joke. It really was an interesting solution for the time period that it was released in. It had a lot of adoption, and still today, there are a lot of companies that are still deploying solutions based on .NET Nuke. So it's definitely far outlived what I thought it would when I originally created it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, like if we don't want to date ourselves, let's not say how much it would be coding in .NET and those kind of things.
Yeah, because really .NET Nuke was it was introduced in like .NET version 1, so that's going back a long time.
But we are here today to talk about Oqtane, and I don't know if you want to start with your slides.
Yeah, sure. I can give you a little bit of an elevator pitch. Since a couple of you are already familiar with .NET Nuke, this is all going to seem very familiar to you, sort of like a .NET Nuke v2. I guess the reason why I kind of started off on this path with Oqtane is this has always kind of bothered me in the .NET world is, when we build applications, they're really complex. They're very sophisticated, but the examples that we're given to start with are often like hello world, right? Like something that is so simple and not realistic that it takes us a lot of time and effort to actually figure out how to build a really robust enterprise grade application. And so that's always kind of bothered me. And when I originally created .NET Nuke, I was trying to solve that problem. And when I got involved with Blazor, which was back in 2018 when it was still in a preview phase, I felt like the examples that were available for Blazor were also way too trivial, way too simplistic for building a really robust application using that technology. And I thought there's got to be something better available for developers. And so I thought, okay, I can execute on this same playbook again that I did with .NET Nuke, and I can create an application framework. I can base it on Blazor, I can base it on .NET Core, and I can provide a pretty solid foundation for developers to build applications on top of. And I think we're all pretty familiar with what applications provide, right? They're designed to accelerate the development of the work that you do as a developer. And they do that by providing some standards that you can build around, some patterns that you can follow. And they try to automate a lot of the things that you would bump into if you just tried to build something from scratch by yourself. I guess the other aspect of this was code reusability has always been a big topic that I've been keen on. Going again way back to the original version of .NET, I felt like the original web forms model had a lot of code reusability built into it, especially on the UI stack. Once we sort of transitioned into MVC, we lost a bit of that, I would say. But then once I saw Blazor, I was super excited because I realized, we could get a lot of those great capabilities back again. And so I thought, okay, this is definitely something that needs to be built into this framework, is a heavy focus on reusability. And so following the same kind of architectural model that .NET Nuke followed, I thought I should build a modular application. And I think that a lot of people understand that the concept of modularity, right? So you build things in an independent manner so that they're not tightly linked to one another. And then you can deploy them independently from one another. There's a lot of different names that people apply to these types of applications today: composable applications, microservices, micro front ends, modular monolith, vertical slices. Like there's a ton of different names, but they all boil down to basically the same thing. But I think the problem is that if you asked most .NET developers today if they're building modular applications, they would say, yeah, absolutely we are. And then you'd say, well, okay, can you tell me how you're doing it? And they're saying, well, we're using NuGet. Okay, so yeah, maybe you're building composable parts that are packaged up as NuGet packages, but really that's only like part of the story. Because by default in sort of the Microsoft development world, NuGet packages are really a development time concept. But when we're talking about real modularity, we're talking about the ability to deploy independent bits out into your production environment instead of having to do a wholesale push of everything every time. And I see that, the sort of the default patterns that people follow today, yes, they're using NuGet for development, but when it comes time to do actual deployments, they rely on the Microsoft tooling, which of course sort of forces you into doing very monolithic type deployments. And so Oqtane wanted to embrace full modularity, and so that means everything from development all the way through to deployment. And I guess another big aspect that I wanted to focus on, and this has always been a huge focus of .NET Core, and which has of course been rebranded to .NET now, is performance. I guess my experience with web forms and building .NET Nuke, and over time sort of it became pretty apparent that stack had some performance limitations to it, which obviously Microsoft also recognized, and that's why they introduced .NET Core. These were a sort of a key capability that I wanted to exemplify as part of the Oqtane framework as well. Is that always a heavy focus on performance, and this doesn't mean just runtime performance, right? Like benchmarking runtime. This means like all aspects of performance, like how quickly can you get a development environment up and running so that you're productive, right? How quickly can you iterate on your code and push out new versions, right? So all of those are aspects of performance which you need to take consideration of. So that led to the introduction of Oqtane. Sort of the high-level goals were to accelerate the development of modern digital experiences. And it does that by providing a set of building blocks and services that you can utilize in your applications. It's fully open source, licensed under an MIT license, and it's been a member of the .NET Foundation for, I think, about 3 years now. And really, I mean, it's since the very beginning of Blazor, it's been really pioneering the adoption and usage of Blazor because it really takes advantage of the Blazor component model as part of its modular capabilities. I guess the other thing that I wanted to do right from the outset, which I did not do with .NET Nuke, is I wanted to actually formalize the philosophy of this open source project. And this was pretty important because once you start maintaining an open source project, you're going to have a lot of different stakeholders who come to you and say, you know, I really wish it would do X or Y or Z. And if you don't have a philosophy to point to, it's really hard for them to understand why you would say no to some of these requests. So by formalizing sort of these pillars of a philosophy early on, it made it clear to the community, like, this is the goal of the product. This are the areas that it's going to focus on. If it's outside of that realm, don't be surprised, right, if basically your requests are denied. And I think that this is also an aspect of open source that people don't understand, right? Open source projects are built around someone's vision, right? And there's plenty of times where that vision doesn't align with the usage that other people might desire. However, you know, in that case, then there's always the ability to fork the project, make it do what you want, and create your own version of the project. That's like one of the freedoms of open source. But obviously, if you stick with the philosophy and sort of work together on the same roadmap, you often end up with better results. Conceptually, the architecture for Oqtane, this is probably, you know, for anyone who's technical, it's not too surprising. It uses the sort of client-server model that is popular and is almost like a basic requirement within Blazor. I think that the interesting part here is that one of the goals of Oqtane from the very beginning was to support all of the hosting models, not just cater to one specific hosting model. And so in order to do that, we really had to embrace the client-server architecture because, of course, it's like possible to build Blazor server applications that are not client-server, right, where everything runs on the server and you don't have to worry about client-server architecture. But the moment you want that application to run on Blazor WebAssembly, of course, then you need it to be a client-server architecture. And so that was always the approach right from day one, both for the core framework and within all of the application templates that that the framework provides for developers to extend it. So on the server side, of course, you've got .NET Core, you've got EF Core, you've got the Oqtane, which uses a repository pattern for doing data access. It's also got its own headless API layer, which of course is required as part of a client-server model. Oqtane is also using the I-hosted service capability that's part of .NET to allow for asynchronous scheduled jobs to run in the background. And we're going to tackle the fact that it's multi-tenant in a minute. On the front end, it supports Blazor Server, WebAssembly, and hybrid models. It has its own service layer that it provides so that it makes it easy for developers to be able to call the back-end API endpoints. And it has a composable UI model, which I'll explain more in a moment. So moving on to multi-tenancy. So this was a key capability that .NET Nuke provided, and I think it's one of the reasons why it had such high adoption. Basically, multi-tenancy is a virtualization concept that allows you to serve the needs of multiple clients within the same infrastructure. Obviously, there's other ways to achieve multi-tenancy as well. Like you could use hardware-based multi-tenancy, you can use containers, right? But if you want to use a software-based approach, an application-based approach, then there's certain things that you have to do. And I guess this is something that Microsoft has never really provided support for as by default within the various bits that it provides as part of the .NET framework. So this was always put on as a responsibility for application providers to build multi-tenancy into their applications. Oqtane supports two different types of multi-tenancy. So it supports both an isolated model where you can have the same runtime, but have your client databases separated, so separate client data stored in each database, or you can have a shared model where the client data is commingled within a single database. And of course, this is, depends on what your needs are as a business. If you really need to have strong isolation between your data, then you should go with the isolated model. If you perhaps you want to save some money and not spin up as many databases, you can use the shared model. I guess the one thing I'll point out here is that .NET Nuke only supported the shared model, which certainly did have some challenges in certain environments. And also it had challenges when it came time to perhaps migrate one of your tenants out of an environment into another environment. You had to sort of, disentangle all of that data, which was commingled. Whereas if you had isolated the data to begin with, migrating is actually pretty simple. From a database perspective, Oqtane uses EF Core, and so it's able to support multiple database engines. So support SQL Server, support SQLite, MySQL, and Postgres. And it supported these for, I think, the last 2 or 3 years. When Oqtane was originally created, it only offered support for SQL Server, which was fairly limited in the sense that it's a .NET Core-based application, and it should be cross-platform, right? And in order to be cross-platform, then you really need to embrace other types of databases which are more native to those other types of platforms. So this was a big feature that was added a couple of years ago, and it's kind of interesting because I find that it's not really a question of, I need to use MySQL or I need to use SQL Server. Often you'll have heterogeneous environments where someone will want to use SQLite for local development because it's so simple and lightweight and inexpensive. And then they're going to deploy the bits out to a Postgres environment or a SQL Server environment for actual production. And this model works very well for that. The other thing that Oqtane introduced a couple of years ago was the Backend-for-Frontend security pattern. So this came about as a result of wanting to embrace external login providers, so identity providers. And it just seemed that the industry was moving in this direction and moving sort of back to cookie-based models for web application. And so the backend-for-frontend architectural model made a lot of sense for that. It was a good fit for Oqtane. And so when that was implemented, the framework also provided support for JOT tokens as well as an alternative, but those are more for very specific use cases, like if you want to interact with an external UI client, or if you want to communicate with a backend remote API, perhaps you would use tokens for that. But for interacting with the web app, that's all done using the BFF pattern. It was actually quite nice to see that Microsoft decided to also embrace the BFF pattern in .NET 8, which will be out in a couple of months. Oqtane also, rather than only providing support for remote identity providers, also always had a local auth story and used the .NET identity APIs for that. However, it had to wrap those APIs, right, so that they were available in a client server way, and also enhance them so that they were multi-tenant aware. And so the UI for identity was actually rewritten as native Razor components, which is something that, of course, Microsoft is also doing in .NET 8, but this was something that Oqtane did like a couple of years ago, because if you want to have the same user interface behavior and look and feel throughout your entire application, then you're going to want that in your identity section as well as the rest of your application, and that was something that even today is not really possible with the current identity. That should be something that's coming in .NET 8, though. As far as Blazor hosting models, like I said, the idea was that Oqtane should support all the hosting models, and so it supports Blazor Server, Blazor WebAssembly, and Blazor Hybrid. I guess the interesting thing here is that it doesn't just support this per installation. It actually supports this per tenant. And so because an Oqtane installation is multi-tenant, you can specify that for tenant 1, I want to use Blazor Server, and tenant 2, I want to use Blazor WebAssembly. And so you can choose your Blazor hosting model per tenant. And that's all still part of the same runtime installation and same exact framework installation as well. So this ability to, pick and choose whichever Blazor hosting model that you want has been quite a powerful feature for Oqtane. And of course, Blazor Hybrid, when it came out, it's not really a hosting model. It's more of an extension of what Blazor is able to provide. The idea there is that if you build Razor components, you can reuse those same Razor components that you're using in a web context on other devices like mobile and desktop. And that's what Blazor Hybrid provides. And that allows you to have a multi-platform UI capability. So you can, of course, support not just web, but mobile and desktop through the MAUI capabilities. On the UI side, and this is where we're going to talk in a minute about why Oqtane, I guess, has multiple personalities, but it has a composable component UI, which means that it's actually not static in the sense that in your applications that you're building, they're actually composed at runtime from many different components. So rather than in the typical Blazor approach where everything is statically embedded within your Razor components, and so you would have components nested within other components, but they're all static and declared right in your code, and that would make up your application. In Oqtane, these components are dynamically injected at runtime. So all of the configuration for your various pages in your site are externalized. It's actually stored in a database. And so at runtime, that creates a lot of capabilities, meaning like you can add additional routes to your application. You can change route names. You can sort of re-nest things by changing the hierarchy of them. You can delete routes, all of this without restarting the application, right? Because it's all just configuration. Whereas like in a typical Blazor application, if you wanted to add another page to your site, it would require building the page and then redeploying your site, right? That can't be done. It's not something that can be reconfigured at runtime. And so this is why people like to refer to Oqtane as also a CMS, because this kind of dynamic capability is often something that's part of a content management system.
Yeah, I'm feeling shades of SharePoint there.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, SharePoint was also very dynamic in its capability. Oh, it still is. I mean, obviously, SharePoint is still a product. So from a modular perspective, so Oqtane is a framework. The idea with an open source framework is, you try to avoid changing the framework code itself. And so a framework provides extensibility points so that you can extend it with your own functionality. This is primarily done through modules, which was the common term that we also used when we created dotnet Nuke. But in the Oqtane sense, a module is essentially a Razor class library. But it's a Razor class library that has all of the client server characteristics to it. So it uses essentially the Blazor WebAssembly template, right, where it has a client project, where it has all of the Razor components and the service wrappers, which wrap HTTP client. It's got a shared project, which is where your shared models reside. And it's got a server project, which is where all your endpoints reside and your repositories and any other server-side concerns that your application might have. All of these DLLs and static assets are bundled into a NuGet package, which allows them to be dynamically deployed. And so, again, Oqtane uses a slightly different model than traditional .NET in that the NuGet packages can actually be deployed at runtime. Right? So this isn't just a development time concept, right? This is a whole aspect of modularity, right? So you can deploy an individual module into your environment, and without deploying the entire environment. The other thing that Oqtane took seriously early on was support for different cultures, different languages. And so the framework itself is fully localized, and there was many different language or translation packages which have been contributed by open source community members so that the application can be localized into their preferred language. More recently, Oqtane introduced a marketplace. And so this was always a key part of the .NET Nuke experience, right? Is that third-party developers could build extensions. Some of those extensions were open source, some of them were commercial. So if you were a .NET entrepreneur and you wanted to build a product business and you wanted to target .NET Nuke, you could build commercial products and sell it through the .NET Nuke Marketplace. That was always a key enabler for the platform, and that was something that was always a plan for Oqtane as well. And I'm really happy that that's been released in the last couple of months. So there's now a full Oqtane Marketplace. I'm actually going to be doing a presentation about this aspect tomorrow at the .NET Foundation Summit. So one of the challenges with a product that is so versatile, it's like a Swiss Army knife, right? And it's, multi-tenant, multi-language, multi-device, multi-database, multi-IDE, multi-app, right? It's hard to position it because it does so many things, right? It doesn't easily fit into many of the different categories that exist for software today. So basically, we had to pick a couple of personas for the framework. And so we like to see it has multiple personalities because originally the whole goal around Oqtane was to create a web application framework focused on developers for building modern web applications. However, it's really hard for some reason to get away from this CMS term. Like people just see the capabilities of Oqtane and they're like, that's a CMS. And it's like, okay, I'm not going to argue. Originally, I argued with them and I said, no, it's not a CMS. It's an application framework. I finally gave up on that and said, yes, it's a CMS as well. It's a CMS that's targeted at developers because it's not like a site builder, right? There's a lot of really great site builders that already exist today if you want to build a simple website. And I would recommend that you use those site builder products if you're building a simple static website. If you're a developer, though, and you have some content needs and you have very sort of niche or custom application needs as well, then you could use Oqtane to build a website with advanced capabilities. And I guess in that sense, it would be a CMS. And so to cater to these two personalities, I actually have these two domain names registered, Blazor Kit and Blazor CMS. And I guess one of the other things, in case there's folks that are watching this that kind of wonder what the relationship is between .NET Nuke and Oqtane. There is a common feature set between the two, right? They both support multi-tenancy. They're both modular. They're both composable in the nature of their user interface. They're both open source, and they both support localization. But that's all conceptual kind of features that are in common. From a technology perspective, they're like 100% different. So where .NET Nuke, from a technology perspective, only supported Windows, was built on the .NET Framework, only supported SQL Server, was built on the Web Forms UI framework, was completely server-side, was a monolithic application, and only supported web as its sort of device. Oqtane is cross-platform. It is based on .NET Core. It supports multiple databases. It uses Blazor and MAUI for its client-server front-end capabilities, supports microservices, and it supports web, desktop, and mobile through the use of Blazor Hybrid. So completely different. If you look at the actual code, you will see no similarities between them at all.
Interesting. We do have our first question coming in, Shaun.
Yep.
So let me interject here real quick. David from
Go
YouTube
ahead.
is asking, does environment need to restart after module update, or is it a runtime dynamic?
So this is actually a characteristic of .NET is like, so if you're building a module, it would have, like if it's a, a true modern .NET application module, it would use dependency injection. And dependency injection by default, using the default way in .NET, can only register those service as part of startup. So when you install a new module that's part of Oqtane, yes, you have to restart the application. And that's a limitation, I would say, of .NET. And I've talked to the .NET team about this before, and it seems like that there's no desire to figure out a way to kind of solve that problem. And so, yeah, I would love it if it was fully dynamic. There are ways that you can do things that are fully dynamic. Just don't use dependency injection.
Got it. Cool. Awesome. Thank you.
So I guess as far as like the release roadmap is concerned, like I said, this started way back in 2018 when Blazor was still in a preview stage. It's had a lot of releases since then. The latest Oqtane 4 was released in June, and that was the update to .NET 7. We expect to have an update to .NET 8, in fourth quarter of this year, soon after .NET 8 ships. I guess at the time that Oqtane was introduced, there weren't, of course, like Blazor was brand new, so there weren't really any viable options as far as frameworks that were targeted specifically at Blazor. Now there seems to be, there's a few more applications or templates or things that are basically saying that they're frameworks. I think that the framework term is a little overloaded. Like in the sense of Oqtane, what a framework is it's, something that can be upgraded independently of the applications that you've built on top of it, just like .NET or Blazor. And so that you have this upgrade path as you upgrade the framework, and it doesn't affect the applications that you've built on it, assuming that we take care of backward compatibility, which is part of our philosophy. Whereas like if you use some of the other Blazor templates that are out there, they allow you to create an initial application, but then as you customize it, there's no way that you can upgrade that template without a whole lot of manual effort. And so that's a pretty big difference between a framework like Oqtane and some of the other Blazor templates that exist today. So I think we should actually show something.
Sure. And while you're transitioning over, we do have another question here. Antonio is asking, Are you doing this alone or do you have a team of collaborators?
So I started this on my own in 2018, and it's sort of a labor of love. I've been putting a lot of time into it for quite a number of years now. However, it is an open source application, and there has certainly been a lot of contributions over time. Like if you go to the GitHub repository for Oqtane, you'll see that I think we're up to about 45 contributors at this point. So there's definitely been a lot of interest, and there's been a lot of folks who have contributed bug fixes, functionality. So I have not built this entirely on my own, but I have invested a lot of time into it.
Awesome.
All right. So in Visual Studio, this is actually like the code from the latest dev branch. So if you go to GitHub and clone the latest dev branch, this is the code that I have locally here. You can see that the way that the framework is structured is the client server sort of model, essentially the Blazor WebAssembly template model, where you have the client project, a server project, and a shared project. In the server project, I've got the app settings.json open here, and it's got a few different settings, of course, in it. But in order to do an installation, of course, because Oqtane requires a database, there should be a connection string. It's blank right now, and so when we run it, it's going to launch into an installation wizard for us, so that we can install the application very simply. This is where you would choose.
Wait a second, real quick, just so everyone understands. It was blank. Your settings are blank to start with, and
correct.
Your framework is capable of detecting that, and instead showing like this installation wizard.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, cool.
Yeah. And of course, you can choose whatever database you want. I'll just use LocalDB since it's simple. I got to create an initial account.
And of course,
so
the
that I can log
password is
into
just
the site.
password, right?
Yeah, of course, because it's local. And okay, and so I provide basic details so that it creates my initial user account. Oqtane also supports templates so that it can template out an entire site. I'll just use the default, but there's an empty site template if you don't want any of the pages to be created. And you can create your own templates as well. They're very simple to create. And when I say install now, it's going to go ahead and it's going to run all of the migrations that are required for the database that I chose, of course. And it's going to use that template to scaffold a bunch of default content into this site. And so I created, a number of pages here. So I got a home page. And if I use this edit icon here, I can see that this home page has a default pane, which is sort of just a region on the page, and it has a module instance here. It's got another module instance here, and a third one here. So it's got 3 different modules that are dynamically injected into this page at runtime. The private page just got a single module on it, but this demonstrates that there can be some pages in your site that are private. So every page, if I go into the page management area, there's metadata, of course, stored for this particular page, but there's also permissions. So I can say who's allowed to actually view this page. So administrators of the site can see it, registered users are allowed to see it, but like if I say all users, anonymous users are not allowed to see it. So actually, if I log out, we'll see that, yeah, that page is gone. So if I go back in here again, log in. So like I said before, you can create an unlimited sort of number of virtual pages because it's all just configuration. And you can put as many different modules on the page as you want. And we saw down at the bottom here that you can have many different pane layouts so that you can add these modules to different panes if you want to lay out the content in different ways. And then there's a control panel that's available through this cog icon where you can get access to, add an additional page, edit the page capabilities, delete. But you can also choose from a list of modules that could be injected. So the HTML text module is the only module which is included by default. And it is the ability to basically edit content in different regions. But this is, of course, where your modules, if you built them, would show up as well. There's also a bunch of admin modules, and I'm actually going to show you that in a minute here. So if we go into the admin dashboard, we've got a whole bunch of extra admin functionality that is included by default. So site settings are important because, like I said, an Oqtane installation can have multiple sites. Essentially, this is the multi-tenant capability within Oqtane. There can be multiple sites, and each site is identified by a unique URL. So if you're in production, those could be domain names. If you're running locally, these could be just subfolders. So localhost, and then my port number / site2 could be another site. So I could have many different sites that are part of my local installation as well. Each site can have a set of pages. Each site can have its own set of users. And again, this user management is using the .NET identity under the covers. It also has sort of extra capabilities beyond what the .NET identity provides, like this profile management capability. I can set up dynamically which profile fields I want people to maintain in their user profile. So this is what it provides by default. I can add additional profile options for this site, or I can actually remove some of these if I don't want some of them. And then when I go to my actual user profile, it uses those to dynamically generate this form for me. So it takes a lot of the work out of the way of building sort of, user management, profile management, and things like that. It's also got role management, and this is where you can set up as many different types of roles as you want, and you can use those roles to define the permissions for various items in your site. It's got a whole file manager capability, so you can define various folders. You can upload files to those folders. Each folder can have its own set of permissions. It's got a recycle bin for when you delete pages or modules from your site. They go into the recycle bin initially so that you can choose to restore them if you want to bring them back, or you can permanently delete them. It's got a URL mapping capability so that when there are 404s that happen within a site, and this is super important when you're doing like a site migration to Oqtane, you'll have URLs that existed on the old site that of course aren't mapped yet on the new site. If 404s happen, they will be logged in the URL mapping area, and then you can go in and provide what the actual URL those requests should be mapped to. And so then you can, sort of provide that nice migration continuity between an older site to a new site. There's also visitor management. So for anonymous users, it's nice to be able to both track them, but also provide some level of personalization around them. So essentially what this visitor management does is it just, drops a cookie, and then it can pick up that cookie in subsequent visits to the site. And then you can, of course, say personalization options around a visitor. The event log is where every action that you perform within Oqtane is logged. So not just errors, but logins, logouts, events that happen during the initial installation. If I add a new page, it'll be logged. If I modify a page, it'll be logged. So you got like the full audit trail of capabilities. If there are errors that happen, it will also be able to email the administrator of the site to let them know that a critical error occurred. And it saves 30 days by default of the events for a site. Site management is where you would add additional sites, so you can have many different sites that are part of your installation. Each of these sites can have a different, so actually if I say add site, we can say that we provide some basic information, a unique URL for the site. The themes are sort of the look and feel, which template you want to use, and which runtime you want to use for that site. So you can choose Blazor Server, Blazor WebAssembly, or Hybrid. And then you also have the ability, if you want to create a site that's part of the master database, so the shared database, you can do that, or you can create a new database as well. So to keep your data isolated from one another. Module management. So this is, of course, where it tells you, I have the HTML text module installed. I also have a whole bunch of admin modules. If I want to create a new module for Oqtane, I can use this wizard and go into module management, and I can provide some basic information, and it has some templates for scaffolding out a complete set of code so that you can have a functional module to start with. So that scaffolds out, a solution file, project files, code files, static assets, everything that you would need to basically build a module. The other thing that we have in modules is, of course, the ability to install modules. And so this is hooked up to the marketplace. And so if I wanted to install one of these modules, let's say it was the blog module, I can click download, and this is very much like an app store model, where it'll download the blog module from basically this blog module is on NuGet because it's an open source package. You can download it to your installation, and then once it's downloaded, you can restart your application, and it will automatically be installed, including running all of the migrations for the database, and you'll have a blog module that you can then add to a page in your site.
Where is there a registry somewhere of all the NuGet packages and GitHub repositories that?
Yeah. So Oqtane.net is the Oqtane Marketplace. And so anyone can create an account here, and you can submit your products. And by submitting a product, you basically provide all the information about a product, like where the download is, right? It could be on GitHub, it could be on NuGet. Those are the only two supported locations currently, because people trust those as download sources. They don't trust random sites. So yeah. So then for commercial.
I was just going to say, do you review these modules, or I mean, and not that you would, not necessarily that you would go, fully under the covers with them, but I'm just concerned about malicious actors.
Yeah, so currently there is no review process for modules, and that was the exact same case with .NET Nuke. So yeah, there is a certain amount of trust, I guess, that you put into downloading anything off the internet, right? So so currently there is no review process. So that's how you can install modules. You can also install themes in the same way. And a theme, like let's say, so there's two default themes. There's a Blazor theme and an Oqtane theme. So if I go into my site settings and I go into the appearance area, I'm going to change the theme to the Blazor theme for this site and save it. And so it changes to that, the typical Blazor look and feel, right? Where you've got now a menu, on the left-hand side, and obviously all of the pages have accommodated sort of that new theme. So that's the theming capability. Theming is all based on Razor components and HTML, CSS, standard stuff. Language management is where you'd set up multiple languages if your site supports multiple languages. Scheduled jobs are where you would have any scheduled jobs, so background processes that need to run. And they're very simple to create. They're based on that, like I said, the I-hosted service interface. But you can, if you're creating a scheduled job, right now there's none that are registered because I just created this application. But there's ways that you can set up the schedule so they run at a specific time of day. They can run every day. They can run every week, every month. So all of that is kind of built in for you. SQL management, so you can run actual queries against your backend database. This is more helpful during development. If you don't want to spin up something like SQL Enterprise Manager or something, or use the tools that are part of Visual Studio or other areas, you can actually run queries in here. Or if you're doing diagnostics.
Could you do like fault injection and just drop tables and see what happens? Don't do that, probably.
So you have to be the host user of the site to get here. So if you were a host user and you wanted to drop tables, absolutely you could. System info basically just tells you a bunch of different details about your installation. You can set some configuration. These are app settings. And then it also has the ability to see a system log as well. And it does have a system update capability as well, meaning it will check to see if the version of Oqtane that you're running is the latest version that's available of the official releases. And if it's not, it'll tell you that there's an upgrade available, and you can choose to do an upgrade. So very much like WordPress or other sites can do. This was a bit of a feat to get to work in .NET, but it does fully work. So it'll essentially download the framework. It'll spawn a process info, which will shut down your site, unpack the files, bring your site back up, and your site will be completely updated.
That's amazing. So with all of the stuff that you've just shown, I've got a question. What is next, and what haven't you thought of? Because I feel like this is pretty feature complete.
Like any product, there's sort of infinite things that can be done. But I think so on the roadmap, I think that the next major features are, well, really .NET 8 support. That'll be a big one that has to be done within the next couple of months, and trying to figure out how to leverage the new capabilities of .NET 8. Obviously, there's a lot of hype around the new United model. Like digging under the covers on the United model, it has certain limitations that I've seen, in the sense that it's all based on static routing. Oqtane doesn't use static routing. Oqtane doesn't even use the default Blazor router. Oqtane has its own custom router so that it can handle the dynamic capabilities of being able to add routes and modify routes and delete routes at runtime. So static routing doesn't work. And so hopefully Microsoft has been, thoughtful enough in their architecture of the new features for Blazor United that there's a way to make it work with applications like Oqtane. So that's I think there's going to be a lot of work around that, because I do believe that that Blazor United is an interesting approach, especially for an application like Oqtane, because there's a lot of content in the site that is static in nature, which could be served from the server. There's no need for this module, for example, to be interactive in a Blazor sense, right? It could be served from the server, and that's all that's needed. And that would provide some performance boosts for an application like this. So conceptually, it's a perfect fit. Technically, is it possible with the way that the team has developed Blazor United? Yet to be seen.
Okay, awesome. What about in terms of like if there's issues or other feature requests from the community, would you encourage them to go through GitHub?
Yeah. So everything is managed through the Oqtane Framework repo on GitHub. And like I said, all the releases are here.
And one interesting thing you mentioned, like it's localized, and we've got viewers from all around the world. So if there's like translations that wanted to be submitted, is there a separate repo for that? Or?
Yeah, so the Oqtane organization has a translations repo where you can see some of the different languages that are represented here. So Arabic, Czech, French, German, Italian, Netherlands, so Spanish, Urdu. Yeah, so there's a lot, Vietnamese. So there's a lot here. And this is a good place to add additional translations.
That's great.
I think that the challenge, though, that I've seen with translations is that someone, it's a lot of work to go through and do the initial translation and provide all of the translated values for all the keys. But after doing that, it seems like there's less motivation to keep it up to date with new versions of Oqtane, which that's always a challenge, right? It's a lot of work, and so I don't know how to solve that problem. Maybe if there was multiple people that were contributing to an individual language, that would help instead of it just being one person. But that's definitely something I've seen as a bit of a challenge.
And you're using Resax for localization?
Yeah, using the standard, like the standard .NET based localization format. So Resax compiled into satellite assemblies. And that's something I guess I didn't really cover, but so when we talked about modularity at the beginning and how modularity needs to encompass not just development, but like deployment as well, it's a bit of one of the other challenges with deployment around modularity is that if you can imagine that you have a .NET based application and it's made up of a whole bunch of different Razor class libraries, but they're not tightly coupled together, right? The dependencies aren't necessarily known. It means that at runtime, the application needs to figure out on its own what dependencies that it has, because the .NET runtime isn't going to figure that out for you. By default, the .NET runtime is going to load only the things that the Oqtane framework knows about. It doesn't know about all of the third-party components that you are using in your site. So Oqtane has to download those, or it has to recognize that they exist for one, and then it has to load those into the app domain so that they're available at runtime using reflection to be dynamically injected into your output. And then to take that one step further, when you're using something like Blazor WebAssembly, right, it needs the client browser needs to figure out which assemblies need to be downloaded to the browser. You can't rely on Blazor to do that for you. Again, that's something you need to take responsibility for, and that's what Oqtane provides for you. And similarly for MAUI, right? It also needs to download assemblies. And actually, I'll show you that in a minute here. So I still have Oqtane running somewhere here. Here. And so I have this site running. And then I have a MAUI solution as a separate solution. Right now I have this MAUI solution pointed at the same URL that my web application is running from. And I have it configured to use my Windows machine as my emulator for MAUI. So if I run this, it should run my Windows device, and boom, what it did behind the scenes is it actually interrogated the Oqtane server to see which modules it needs to download into this MAUI instance, and it pulled them down dynamically, loaded them into the app domain so that it can instantiate them within this MAUI container. And it's smart in the way it does it because it uses hash codes to determine if those DLLs have changed. So if I run this application a second time, it's not going to download this DLLs unless they've changed. So there's this auto servicing capability that's part of Oqtane as well, so that you don't have to manually update your client installations. For example, if it was a desktop installation, right? You don't have to go and update your client installations if one of your module changes. You deploy the module to the server, it auto updates it for you. And so you got like full functionality within MAUI to do the same types of content management things that you can do on the web, right? It's high fidelity, exact same experience because we're sharing the same components between MAUI and web. So hopefully I've blown your mind here a little bit. There's so much that's part of this Oqtane framework at this point. I definitely think developers, rather than building something from scratch, should be checking this out because it provides just so much out of the box.
Awesome.
That's what we noticed today. There is a lot of functionality built in. So thank you, Shaun, for providing that to the community. I think I encourage folks that were watching to go check it out and give it a try. Contribute to the localizations. I noticed there is no Brazilian Portuguese there, so I might go there later on. Yeah, so thank you so much, Shaun, for joining us today. We appreciate, and I love learning more about the project. And tune in for next week. We're gonna have I'm gonna butcher his name. I had thought we'll figure it out how to properly pronounce it, but he's gonna be talking about Nuke for C# development. So thanks for hanging with us here today and for hanging out here with us today and watching on .NET Live. You can check out other great .NET Live streams and videos at .net/live. We have plethora of shows every week, every day. So tune in next week to check out the new show. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.